Summer, we asked Arturo if he would share his thinking on the state of the global economy through the lens of social mobility. And we're very conscious in CRF that as HR leaders, there's a balance that we have to achieve between maximising the economic performance of our businesses, but also being mindful of how that plays out in the day-to-day experience of people who work within our organisations. And I think what we're seeing now is that tension is becoming all the more apparent over the last few weeks as we grapple with the challenges of keeping the workforce safe and well, but also dealing with the longer term fallout from the crisis. So clearly we're in the very early stages of working that out, but what we're hoping today is that Arturo can give us some signposts to direct our way forwards, and hopefully give us some inspiration for the future. So Arturo, over to you.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. The first thing I want to do is I want to do a very small sound check. So please give me thumbs up if you can hear me well, and then I know that you are all there. Fantastic. I'm very glad to be with you. I think it's the first or second time in my life that I dress up to be at home. So, I feel completely different, and I guess that as many of you, this is a new life. As Gillian said, we planned this session already some time ago, when we were not in the crisis where we are. And obviously I understand that many of our discussions today will go around the issue of the COVID-19 and what is the future and so on. And I will probably relate to that. But my discussion today is much more fundamental and probably much more long-term than what we are living today. Let me share with you my slides. And again, if there is any question or any comment during the presentation, use your chat toolbox, or just by the time I stop for questions, you can ask directly. Let me share my presentation, and then we can immediately move on. Okay. So, the discussion that we'll have today is about walls, and the thing that I want to introduce is this idea that our world is changing, was already changing, into a much more local world in many different perspectives. And I'm going to touch upon those in a second. But let me begin with the present. Certainly for many of us, I think that the next part of our life is about to start. I think that we are going through a massive transformation of our way of living. We're going through a massive transformation about the types of jobs and the way we work. And certainly we're going to start something new. Okay? So I could start this presentation by saying that for most of us, the current crisis will mark our lives. And obviously, many things are going to change. Let me take a completely or somehow different perspective. I think that when you look at the bigger context, when you look at what is happening today in the context of the larger history of our world economy, I think what we can say is that despite the loss of human lives, obviously, of this crisis, I think we need to minimize a little bit what is going on. And my opinion is that some things will change, but most things are going to get back to normal. So we need to take a longer term perspective. I think we need to look at the world where we live, and then we need to think of the world that we're going to go through in the coming months, years, and decades. Okay. Let me tell you about myself, and that will be a good way of introducing our discussion today. I have two children. My son is 22, my daughter is 20. They are both now confined in the US, and I haven't seen them obviously for some time already, even though we speak every day. Okay? Between my children and I, there's a massive gap that I'm going to call the generational gap, because we're living through completely different stages of history. Let me go back to my own life. Okay, I was born on May 9th, 1967. So if you do the math, I'm 52. And what I want to show you here is that the performance of stock markets, in this case, the Dow Jones index, throughout my entire life. This is the life of a baby boomer. For a baby boomer like me, we grew up in a society in which things were going somehow okay. There were a massive crisis, probably in my childhood, we had the oil crisis, which was not, in my case, being Spanish, not of a big impact. And, we went to university, I went through the 1987 mini crash that you can see today, went to take my PhD in France, and then I got my first job at the Yale University in 1998, where I went through my first crisis, my first big crisis, what was the internet collapse, and later on, you know, smaller blips in markets. After Yale University, in 2007, I came to IMD, and I started my finance professorship role in the middle of at that time, the largest financial crisis that the world had ever suffered. And since then, you can see that the performance of markets has been extraordinarily good. And we're basically going through a small blip in our history, which we can call the COVID-19 crisis. So if you take things in perspective, you can think that this crisis is not that big. Okay. Now let me show you my son, because the life of a baby boomer like me has been plagued by crises in our adult life. We have been used to shocks only in our adult life. But this is the life of my son. My son is 22 years of age. He just graduated from university, and he was born on January 11th, 1997. This is the performance of the Dow Jones throughout his life, up to date. Of course, he's much younger than me, so I have to cut down earlier. Thank God. But as you can see, you know, for a millennial, my son, you know, they have gone through crises here and there. They have gone through the internet bubble, they have gone through the Lehman Brothers crisis, and now they have gone through this one. This is the needy generation, because this generation has grown up, that is, has become adult in a period of amazing run-up in markets. As you can see from the graph, it is historical, and by any standards, the performance of our market between 2008 and 2020 has been, if anything, amazingly stellar. Okay. Now, let's compare the two of us, 22 years of age, and for my son's first 22 years of age, our lives resemble something very similar, except for the fact that, as you can see in the red line, for my son Felipe, he had to go through the Lehman Brothers crisis, which was somehow a big shock. But what about the future? This is the last graph that I'm going to show you comparing the two of us. But now let me extend it to myself again, my entire life, and this is my son's life up to date. You have to be aware that relative to the previous graph, the scales have changed. So the red line that you saw earlier is the same red line that you see now. And that's my son's life, and that's the future that should expect for my son. To me, there is something that is quite shocking, because if I want my son to have the same life that I have had, it should be the case that the performance of markets that has been, at least we thought, stellar in the last 10 years, should multiply times 10 for him to have the same wealth, the same life, the same markets, and the same economy that I and many of you have had. If you're in your 50s, we have gone through an amazing period of history. Now, what I want to entertain with you, this idea of this hypothesis, the future for the new generation is going to be extremely tough. You see, the likelihood that the blue line replicates for the millennials is extremely low. The chances that in my son's next 30 years, he will see the performance of markets multiply sixfold in a period of 30 years is, in my opinion, impossible, especially given that what we have seen. And I'm not saying that I'm a millionaire. I'm not saying that I have made an amazing progress in my life that I can consider myself extremely successful. But if I expect my son to have at least the standard of living that I have today, I find it extremely tough. And that's why it's very important to consider not the life that is expected for us, but the life that is going to be expected for this generation. Because it's going to be extremely difficult. And especially if we have to promote it and to develop it, it's going to be extremely tough on us to develop that. This is an introduction, and I want to make sure that you are with me and address any question or comment if you have any so far. Any comment to make, any opinion, any complaint? Okay?
I think we can proceed, yeah.
Okay, so this was an introduction, so let me then proceed to the meat of our discussion, because I think that, you know, what I refer to is a generational gap that is going to mark the next 30 years. In the next years, the world is going to witness the biggest wealth transfer in human history, from baby boomers, myself, to millennials, the Generation Z. But this generational gap is unique in history, because our generation, my generation, and I'm not extending to many of you who are much younger than me, my generation is also the first learning generation that we have seen in modern history, because we learn from our parents. Our parents taught us everything that we know, but we are not learning much from our children. In fact, our children are teaching us a lot, because they are technology savvy, because they are experts in many things, and because their lives are completely different to our own. I grew up in Spain. I speak Spanish. I barely speak English, as you can hear, and my French is so-so. I cannot help my children doing their homework because they go to an international school, or they went to an international school. So we're a learning generation. And this marks one of the walls that we're going to see in the coming years. But there are several walls, several barriers that we're imposing among us. One is this generational gap that I have referred to, but there are many others. There is a wall between genders, a wall between us and our planet, a wall between economic powers, okay, and especially enhanced today, a wall between the healthy and the unhealthy. And I think the coronavirus crisis is going to highlight that much more than ever before. A wall between rich and poor nations, and obviously a wall between rich and poor people. And finally, and because of that, a crisis of democracy that results on a wall between people and their leaders. And that's what I want to refer to in the next minutes. You know, a wall between generations, because the jobs that the new generation will do are different from our own. A wall between genders that will require us to close the gender gap. The environmental challenge as a massive wall that separates us from the planet. Trade wars and the impact of deglobalization. COVID-19 and a new type of inequality that I will refer to. The technology race, immigration, populism, and the crisis of democracy. They are all separating us, and we need to confront them if we want for our kids the future that we had. So that's why I call this back to the future. I would like to see a next generation with global citizens in a global world, where technology empowers people at the expense of leaders, and where there are no borders. That's my dream. Obviously, I think that today we're less global than 50 years ago. Technology doesn't truly empower people at the expense of leaders, at least yet. And obviously, the world is becoming full of borders. And that vision is still not materialized. Okay? On the generational gap, you can see something that is interesting, and let me refer to what I introduced earlier on the future of jobs. We, as workers, the ones that were born in the 60s and 70s, like myself, you know, we grew up through lifetime jobs. Okay? Something that David Graeber from London School of Economics will call bullshit jobs. And actually, you need to wonder this: how many of us do bullshit jobs? A bullshit job is a job that does not generate any value, either because the job is useless or because the company for which you work is useless as well. Okay? David Graeber actually shows statistics in the UK showing that in the UK about 33% of employees do not think that their job creates value for society. And not because they may be working for undesirable industries, it's because the tasks that they perform are completely useless. Bullshit jobs are a characteristic of our times. And I think that's very problematic. Why? Because if we do something that does not create value, we should not get paid for it. And that explains actually why in the last 20 years, real salaries in the world economy have declined. If you exclude China and India, where salaries have increased significantly in the last 20 years, in the Western world, and certainly in the UK, in Switzerland, or in the United States, salaries have dropped. And this is because more and more we're performing bullshit jobs. On average, our productivity is lower because we do activities that do not create any value. Okay? Yet, for us, income has been always the main goal of our task or job, with self-fulfillment being secondary. Okay? Remember that the concept of a job is an activity that is remunerated. And I grew up, my mother told me that getting a job means do something and get paid for it. Whether you like it or not, it will come later. Of course, this makes us individualistic. We care about our own welfare. We're not, very caring as a generation compared to the previous one and compared to the next one. We have learned to use technology. That is, we didn't grow up with technology. I actually remember that I sent my first PDF document by email when I was about to graduate from my PhD program. And you will say, how old you are? Well, I'm talking about 1998, 1999. Okay? And we know very little. That is, at least the things that we know are not extremely useful. Our education forced us to learn things that are completely useless. Like, for example, the rivers of Africa that I had to learn by heart, okay? And the 357 articles of the Spanish Civil Code, which is useful because Spain changed its civil code 10 years ago, and by that time I became obsolete. While if you look at what happened with the Generation Z, with the millennials, with the new people, they're going to perform tasks, not jobs. And this is very important because those tasks will not be bullshit jobs, will actually be what Greber would call shit jobs. That is, activities that are value increasing, productive, but very often not self-fulfilling, because there will be no other jobs left for the new generation. The most interesting jobs will be either automated or performed by highly sophisticated people that will represent a very small minority. So for most of the tasks that the new generation will have to perform, the job will be not necessarily self-fulfilling. And that's why, in fact, self-fulfillment becomes paramount when the new generation has to rank jobs. It's very funny how, when I look at my MBA class of 2020 compared to my MBA class when I started in graduate school in 1999 or 2000, there's a massive difference on the interest of these two generations. For an MBA graduate of 2010 or 2000 or 1995, the dream job was to work for an investment bank or a big consulting company, to land a job in a multinational firm that would ensure a very high-flying professional career. But for the new generation, and I'm talking about my MBA classes of 2018 or 2020, the main objective of getting a job is self-fulfillment. It's not salary, it's not promotion, it's not the reputation of the firm. They all want to work for a nice company with a good team and doing an interesting activity. And the reason for that is that there are fewer and fewer of these opportunities. As a result of that, the new generation focuses much more on collectivism and solidarity than our generation. You will tell me that's generalization. Certainly it is. Of course, you can have both extremes in both generations. But as a generalization, it represents very well the stereotype of these two generations. The millennials are sons and daughters of technology. They were born with technology. And of course, they have learned to use it much better than we have. And that's why they know a lot. That's one advice that I always give executives. Do not learn from your colleagues. Try to learn more from your kids, because kids are going to teach us a lot. And I can tell you that in my particular case, as a professor, many of the things that I teach come from discussions that I have with my children. Okay? So let me talk about this generational gap for the last time, and then I open it up for questions. In the coming year, coming years, global mobility is going to be driven by quality of life, not income. Actually, this is based on some research that we have done at IMD, at the IMD World Competitiveness Center, where we have actually identified that the main driver for mobility among senior executives is quality of life. Controlling for everything else, the proximity, language difference, and so on, executives look primarily for a better quality of life, not for a higher income. And that actually, it is much more representative of the younger generation than on the older generation. There will be several sources of income because the new generation will be multitasking. A few of these tasks will not be necessarily jobs. There will be activities that will be paid, but not necessarily productive activities. Example, influencer as an extreme, or anything that has to do with technology, but which doesn't necessarily involve a physical or intellectual task. And of course, we need to implement basic income schemes to make sure that low-paid jobs and activities that do not guarantee a minimum quality of life have to be supported by either the state or the private sector. Okay? And I don't enter here into discussion on how the optimal mechanism has to be designed, but again, I have done a lot of work about this topic as well. And then what I call the 3-day internship, that is, learning will be faster. For the new generation, given that they're going to perform jobs that change constantly, they need to renew themselves very fast, and this requires very fast learning as well. Normally, an internship is 3 months. 3 months will be too long to learn a new job. 3 days will be enough. Okay? Questions or comments so far about the generational gap before we move on? And it would be nice if you want to exchange any opinion with the rest of your colleagues or something that you want to highlight.
Yeah, absolutely. Just a reminder that you can post any questions in the chat and raise your hand if you want to ask Arturo in person. I'll kick things off. I have a question for you, Arturo, which is just talking about shit jobs and bullshit jobs and the impact of automation. We hear a lot about the impact of automation on employment levels, and I just wonder whether is automation going to give rise to more or less bullshit jobs? Because maybe we need to find things for people to do if all the meaningful work is going to be done by machines.
Yes, so certainly automation is going to create more of these two types of jobs. It will obviously create more shit jobs, which will be jobs that a machine cannot do, but are not necessarily rewarding. But more than anything, as you say, it will create bullshit jobs. That is, technology is going to force us to create new working opportunities for people who are not necessarily value increasing. Okay? This is not necessarily the result of technology alone. We have seen that happening in the last years. But more and more you see that in the services sector, many of the tasks that people perform are bullshit jobs. That is, we need to employ our people. And because we need to employ our people, they need to do something that is self-fulfilling. Then the question is how we will pay for it if they are not generating value. That's why I introduced the idea of basic income. But certainly, briefly to answer your question, there will be more shit jobs and more bullshit jobs.
Okay, we have another question from Mircea. How strong should be the impact of the current crisis? So just how big will the impact of the current crisis be for these Gen Z values to change, do you think? So I guess the question is, do you think this crisis will have such a big impact that it will change the values of Gen Z, and if so, in what ways?
Mm-hmm. Yes, I think that this crisis, and we'll refer to that later, but I think this crisis is doing things. First of all, is forcing us to move much faster than we expected. We're forced to implement changes that we thought would take years to implement, and in particular regarding mobility, regarding distance jobs, distance learning, and so on. Okay, and that transformation actually makes it faster as well for the next generation to change the jobs that they will do. The second transformation is purely technological. That is, what the COVID-19 crisis is showing is how reliant, how dependent we are on technology. And by making us more dependent on technology, it's also making us less productive as individuals. That is, what we can do to produce is much more reduced, because now we rely much more on technology. The human factor in production is going to be diminished.
Okay.
Okay.
Yep. We've got some questions coming through, but what I suggest is that we continue with
yes.
the flow of the presentation, and then we'll come back to some more questions later on.
Okay. Let me go through some of these goals that I was referring to, and some of them are obvious, but I want to highlight some points about them that I consider important. We have an unequal world, and when we refer to income inequality, we tend to focus a lot on inequality within countries, between the rich and the poor. Of course, it is the objective of policies to reduce that inequality. And the political solutions go from populism in many countries in Europe to socialism in some countries in Europe, but also in Asia, to pure systems in which inequality runs amok with no political intervention. But the inequality that is relevant for me is also inequality between people in different countries. So what we call income imbalances between rich countries and poor countries. And of course, that explains why we have these immigration waves that are coming to us in Europe. I think that we need to give a solution to that. And to me, this is urgent. I think a massive wall that we're building between rich countries and poor countries is going to make our world unsustainable. And it requires a change in the individual mindsets to realize that we are not a sustainable society, that we don't have a sustainable future as a society unless we incorporate those people into our way of living. And I know that it requires a lot, but we need to give a solution to this immigration problem. I will not go into details into the graph, but these two graphs from Eurostat and the European Social Survey show that Europeans have become much less willing to accept immigrants next to them, especially when they come from differential race groups or from countries outside of Europe. That's the only message from this graph. Of course, there are differences across countries, but as you can see, in most, if not all of the European countries, there's a massive negative reaction towards immigration coming from different countries. That is not a political problem, and I think that's an individual problem. Same thing happened with the gender gap. Here I just show you some statistics showing the female share of employment in senior and middle management. I have recently written an article about that on the gender gap and the salary gap. Not surprisingly, the Dominican Republic comes on top of the ranking, not because in the Dominican Republic female employees make it easier to the top management level, is because male employees have left the country. And basically most of the senior management positions are occupied by women. In the rest of countries, starting with the United States, we still have an imbalance in top management positions. If you look at statistics on board membership, the results are even more dramatic. Why does this happen? I think, again, this requires a cultural change within organization. We can actually impose the responsibility on policies, and some countries in Europe, Norway, Italy, have imposed quotas, for example, to increase the number of women on board of directors. That is, in my opinion, not enough. I think we require a cultural change that starts with leaders in organizations to allow this gender gap to close and disappear. The environmental wall. I just want to do something very fast here, and my message is very simple. By the way, the cartoon that you have there is by my son Felipe, who, he didn't want to become an investment banker and decided to become an artist. And he's a cartoonist, okay? There's nothing I could do because he didn't want to be like me, okay? But he knows much more than me. And the environmental wall to me arises from the following statement that I want to make. I think that unless we have the right government intervention, if we leave environmental policies up to the decision of individuals, we will never manage to have an environmentally balanced world. Specifically, individuals cannot resolve environmental dilemmas by themselves, and they need policies and regulations to force them to do so. Okay. Let me conduct a very fast survey, because we have an interesting and representative sample here. And this survey tries to highlight this point about environmental dilemmas. Suppose that you are the CEO of a large organization, a financial institution, okay? And suppose that you are confronted with a potential loan to an emerging market in order to build a coal plant that would satisfy the energy needs of the country. Obviously, the dilemma is here that if you provide the loan, you will pollute, but if you don't, this country will not be able to satisfy social needs. Okay? So the dilemma is very easy. It's basically asking you whether you would provide the credit, you would not provide the credit, and another creative potential solution, okay? Because with executives, you never know. Okay. Let me give you a few seconds to reply. Okay, we have about 42 responses. I'm not sure if you can see the results, but 24% of you say that you would provide the credit. 51%, the majority, says that you would not provide the credit because of the environmental damage, and 29% would choose neither one. Okay. And by the way, if you can comment those who responded neither one, what would be your alternative? It would be nice to hear from you if you can mention that to Gillian. But there is no right answer to this question. Now, notice what happens here. My first impulse is to agree with you. You know, if I want to be environmentally friendly, and if I want to protect my world, I would do that at the expense of my own business. Now, the question is, would you be willing to lose your job in order to protect the environment? I have asked this question to several CEOs in the last years, and the majority answer is no, never. That is, if I do this, I would lose my job. And their answer is also, well, if I have to do this, what I need is better regulation. That is, I need a regulation that prohibits me from doing that, because if I give the loan against the will of my shareholders, I will get fired. If I give the loan, if I don't give the loan and I lose profitability, I will be fired. But if the government chooses for me, my decision will be extremely easy. Okay. So that's the point that I wanted to make about the environmental world. I think on that particular front, we need regulation. And the only way how we are going to make the world sustainable is if regulators impose environmental policies on companies and individuals. Because individuals by themselves, they cannot make decisions that go against their own self-interest. Okay. Gillian, any other comment about neither one that I'm interested in to hear?
Yeah, so a couple of comments from the chat. So one person making the point that there are broader environmental and socioeconomic factors to take into account. So you can't necessarily judge just on this one particular point. And it may be that you want to add conditions to a loan, incentives around mitigating the impact, the ecological impact of particular investments. So that's one comment. We also had a question about to what extent does the bank's reputation and commitments around ESG, for example, play into decision making around this scenario?
Thank you. But you know, if it is for reputational issues, then it is not a good objective. That is, I wish that when we make environmental choices, we do them because we want to protect the environment, not because we want to protect our brand. And that's why it is much more important to have policies that force us to do the right thing. So one more thing about the environmental dilemma before I take more questions. No, if you look at what companies do today, is that they impose the environmental cost either on shareholders, but much more likely on customers, and that's not sustainable. Specifically, I want to sell a product that is environmentally friendly, and of course, it is more costly to produce it. So I will go to my customers and say, are you willing to pay more for a more environmentally friendly product? And customers will say yes. Then I become environmentally friendly. But imposing that cost on customers cannot continue forever. Because at that point, customers will say, well, shouldn't you take a cut, either on your salary or on shareholder returns, instead of imposing it on me? What we call win-win-win situations in social responsibility and ESG, you know, rarely happen, and you don't see them very often. Okay, so let me close the poll and then take some more questions generally about everything that we have been discussing.
And don't forget, if you don't want to type a question into the chat and you just want to pose it directly to Arturo, then please you can put your hand up just by clicking on the on your part of the screen and put your hand up. One question, Arturo. This is, I guess, coming at this from a Western point of view. So if you were to put yourself in the shoes of a leader in Africa or in the poorer parts of Asia, might you have a different perspective on this issue?
Of course, that's also important to take into account, and you're perfectly right. Okay, the dilemmas and the challenges in emerging markets are completely different, and they're probably also easier to resolve than for executives in the Western world.
I think I might have heard someone unmuting a second ago. Does anyone else want to jump in with a question? No. Okay,
so let me move on to leave some time at the end for other questions, because what I want to refer now is to anything that has to do with economics, trade, and of course COVID-19. Remember what we finished last year? We're in the middle of a trade war. And the situation in the world economy has changed significantly, because in principle, when we talk about trade wars, all global powers have become global powers through protectionism. I think that is a principle that we need to assume in economics. The British Empire, the United States, the Spanish Empire, the Dutch Empire, all world empires, China in the Middle Ages as well, they became dominant through protectionism. Among the most important economies in the world today, China has been also the most protectionist. And it is not a political statement. You know, by measures of concentration and by measures of barriers of entry, China has been extremely protectionist at home. Okay. After the COVID-19 crisis, it's very interesting that we see a completely new role for China in the world economy. And this has happened in a period of 2-3 years only, because for China, the trade war came at the worst time. That is, at the timing where the United States decided to close its borders and make it more difficult for China to trade, the Chinese growth rates were significantly declining. Fixed capital investment, exports, the Chinese economy that was a miracle 5-7 years ago was starting to become normal, okay, with average growth rates. But look at what has happened in 2020. Because of exactly the same reason, the COVID-19 crisis has also come at the best of possible times for China. Don't think about any conspiracy theory that I have in mind. No, it's actually coincidental. The fact that this virus has created a pandemic in the best possible time for China. And what I mean best possible times is that the COVID-19 crisis is creating a completely new role for China, because it's pushing deglobalization and inequality. And then China is going to take a completely new role. We see that today in Spain or in France or in Italy or in the UK or even in the US, how Chinese supplies are flooding those markets in order to help, to provide assistance. It's like the new Marshall Plan. And remember that while the United States achieved economic dominance in the world by the turn of the 19th century and the 20th century, the United States achieved military dominance after the Second World War and through the Marshall Plan. So deglobalization after COVID-19 is going to resemble the post-war period, with a very strong focus on inward-looking policies and with a new emerging mega power, in this case China, that is going to take over very fast and much more rapidly than we expected from the United States. Because even though there is going to be a recession in both China and the United States, I strongly believe that China will come out of this crisis as the largest economy in the world, beating the US, primarily because it is preserving its overseas markets, okay, by helping and providing support. But also, if you exclude China and the United States, income inequality, again, the difference between the rich and the poor, is going to determine a new type of health inequality. The difference between the healthy and the potentially unhealthy. Okay? As an economic impact of the crisis that is going to be long-lasting, we're going to see that health is going to be one of the major assets that we're going to try to preserve. And of course, health is positively correlated with income, because with better income, it comes better health services. And interestingly, we're going to create a new factor that is going to differentiate societies and people between rich and poor. Notice also that with deglobalization, capital will fly to stronger countries. And this is going to determine also an interesting aspect when it comes to technology. Please, let me go back to the previous slide. We're going to become more local, but capital is never local. Capital is always looking for the best return. Being more local means that now there is going to be a clear differentiation between countries. This didn't happen 10 years ago. 10 years ago, when the economy was truly global, the main factor determining returns was industry. I want to invest in technology and not in consumer goods because returns in technology are higher. Today, with deglobalization, the difference is between countries. I want to invest in the United States and not in Mexico because returns in the United States are higher. They have better policies and they have more resources. And this means that money will fly into those countries. You can see that reflected in technology. The graph that you see here shows the size of the global internet platforms by region. In red, you have the United States, Microsoft, Apple, Alphabet, Google, Amazon. In blue, you have Asia, so China, South Korea, and Taiwan, Alibaba, Tencent, and the likes. In the middle, you have Europe. We don't have digital champions in Europe. And of course, you don't have digital champions in Africa, and you don't see Latin America in the graph at all. Why is it the case? Is it the case that the United States or China is more innovative than Europe? Not at all. Actually, Europe can be considered more innovative than any of these two regions. Switzerland, the country where I live, is considered by many the most innovative country in the world. Israel is considered to be the startup nation. Okay, Estonia is considered to be the smart nation. Okay, what happens? So we don't have this type of platforms in Europe. Well, the answer is capital. Capital takes those platforms to those countries. Examples: Skype, founded in Sweden. Sorry, Skype founded in Estonia. Spotify, founded in Sweden. Many of these companies are now in the United States. Skype, which is European, Estonian, was bought by Microsoft. Okay? So with deglobalization, capital will fight to stronger countries, and this is going to create a massive digital inequality, another type of war. At the end of the day, we're going to see that the next war is not a war for economic or military dominance. It's going to be a war for technology dominance. And we see already this happening. You know, we'll see already this happening when it comes to artificial intelligence investment. That is dominated massively by China and the United States. Okay? So on that aspect of inequalities, let me recapitulate. I think income inequality that we had in the past is going to be exacerbated through COVID-19 and will transform itself into technology inequality and into dominance by certain economies that are going to become the Plan Marshall of the 21st century. And at the end of the day, you know, we're going to have a capital flight from less rich economies to richer economies, thus exacerbating all of these differences. Comments, questions?
Okay, there's a couple of questions related to the global cooperation and response, specifically with regard to COVID-19 and thinking more generally about, for example, the climate emergency and how this might play out, how the global response to climate change might play out. So, question around is COVID-19 a good test for governments in terms of how we tackle the climate emergency, in terms of speed of decision making, social responsibility, collective responsibility?
Yes. I know that this is going to sound odd, but I was extremely pleased with COVID-19 because it shows that I was right. That is, I've been saying for already a few years, and my colleagues can testify that more and more governments are becoming much more important than anything else. As business executives, we tend to worry too much about strategy, leadership skills, people motivation, team dynamics. But the most important factor determining the success or failure of companies is government. And that has been massively tested by this crisis. No? Because the incidence of the COVID-19 pandemic is massively determined by policy responses, by reaction by government, by the type of reactions that government have had, by the political system. We know that dictatorships have responded better than democracies. And all of this actually is consistent with what we saw already in a much lower pace. So definitely, I think that the importance of governments is going to be enhanced by this crisis and what happens next.
Okay, and you talk about the response of governments, but what about global cooperation? Because in fact, we were having a conversation earlier that it seems to have been rather notable by its absence, a coordinated global response to this current crisis. And I just wonder what your perspective is on that, and whether that bodes ill for tackling future global crises.
It is interesting to see that, and this is something different that we used to say. There was a point in the globalization trend in which we said that companies had become the most powerful agents for change. And that has shifted dramatically. I think that the only role today for global corporations in the current environment is to be followers of the government and the governments. And that's what we see. They can contribute, but they cannot implement massive change. Because of course, the response to the COVID-19 is primarily political, or at least based on policies. Okay? So the role of global organizations is diminishing. And not only that, also remember and note that because of this deglobalization trend is also going to affect multinationals. Those companies who operate in China and in Argentina and the United States with offices everywhere are going to become more localized, with local supply chain, with local customers, looking for local talent, exacerbating this trend towards deglobalization as well. So global companies are going to follow as well.
Sorry, okay. What about China's reputation globally? How will that be impacted by this situation?
Mm-hmm. I think that China is going to benefit dramatically in its reputation. I think that surprisingly, when Donald Trump called COVID-19 the Chinese virus, he was crucified. And I think that the West is not willing and ready to blame China for anything, quite the opposite. I think that because China is providing support and China is showing its hand to help, China is going to come out of this crisis much stronger than before. That's why I said earlier, even though we already expect it's happening already, a 12% drop in GDP in China because of COVID-19 in China, it's going to come out earlier than the rest of the countries and it's going to come out stronger.
Okay, and there's a couple of questions, perhaps hoping to put a more positive spin on what we're going through at the moment. So one question is, what new industries do you see being spurred on by COVID-19?
Mm-hmm. Obviously, I think there are two dimensions to take into account. Obviously, there are some industries like pharma, healthcare, technology that are going to benefit enormously from COVID-19. Okay, the new types of work, the importance of health is going to mark a differential performance of this company. But from the financial perspective, I also pay attention to that, and I wrote a recent article about this, actually showing that there are some industries that are extremely in danger because of their financial position. There are many industries that are short in cash. These are not banks in particular, but consumer good companies, for example, capital goods companies and engineering. These are companies that are highly indebted and that they don't have much cash. And these are the companies that are going to suffer. Okay. Finally, I think that industries and companies that are going to benefit a lot are those companies with local supply chains. The more global you are, the more damaged you are going to be by the crisis. Okay. Let me just give you the last few points because I have 4 minutes, and then I just want to conclude on a positive note. Obviously, COVID-19 marks the crisis of our democracies. This is not new. I think that our political leaders, and I don't pretend to make any bad example or positive example on any of those, but actually have been leaders that have been on the spotlight when it comes to their population. We have seen that democracies have failed. Okay. And we have looked for support and inspiration in leaders who are not necessarily from the political arena. Okay, and I just have here football coaches, like you know, Diego Simeone, which is the coach of my football team, Atlético de Madrid, but also Greta Thunberg, or you know, the permanent secretary, the secretary of the WHO. That is, these are not democratically elected leaders, but these are our leaders. And the point here is one where our alternatives as democratic societies are two. One is we move into dictatorships. You know, the systems in Singapore, in Thailand, in China, they work extremely well to cope with crisis. Okay? Hopefully this is not I want for my children. I want my children to live in a democratic society. Or we're going to look at other leaders to inspire us and guide us. Okay? And this requires those leaders and those individuals to step up to that challenge. Okay? And to take a political role and a more political voice in the things that they say. I'm not saying that Cholo Simeone should run for president, don't get me wrong. But what I'm saying is that especially corporate leaders that are going to be very inspiring in the current times because of their messages, I think they should take a political stand. We see that in the United States with Mark Zuckerberg, with Warren Buffett, you know, actually with Bill Gates, obviously, as business leaders that become, you know, social leaders, because our politicians have failed us. Okay. In summary, let me give you a brief summary of what we have discussed. Some of these goals that we have discussed are mental. Some of these goals require policies. Immigration, you know, the gender gap, the environmental challenge, and so on, they are more mental or more individual than other challenges that require policies, like technology, like trade and economic differences, like pandemics, you know, or like immigration and poverty. Okay, so in this array of goals, I think some of these are very urgent. Okay, and by urgent I mean that they need a response that has to happen in the, you know, in the next months or years. Okay, obviously the political challenge at the very right, you know, the difference between differences or lack of trust in our politicians will longer time to resolve. But immigration is extremely urgent because we're moving into a society that is completely uneven. You know, the generational gap, I think we need to close it because our kids are going to take over as our political leaders, and we need to make sure that they have a good word. Gender or the environment are somehow urgent. Technology is not, and certainly coping with COVID-19 is the first priority of our societies. So I think that this gives us a map of our priorities. In my opinion, obviously, once we come out of this crisis, we need to start addressing immigration, gender gaps, environmental challenges, and then technology, trade, and a crisis of our political system. Okay? For some of these challenges, for example, immigration, we need an individual change in mindset. For some, we need new policies. Like obviously, COVID-19 needs to be resolved by our politicians with the help of society, but primarily through policies and regulation. And in the middle, you have companies that have to play a role in technology, closing gender gaps, satisfying this environmental responsibility of our and the demands of the new generation. Okay. And we need to work together. I think at the end of the day, we need inclusive prosperity. I use this term because the center that I direct, the IMD World Competitiveness Center, talks about inclusive prosperity. Competitiveness is inclusive prosperity. How do we create prosperity for all? And technology at the service of people. Okay, that is, we need to educate ourselves in new technologies, in new cultures, to adapt better to the future of labor markets. That is, we need to increase our skill in order to cope with these goals, because, you know, at the end of the day, I think that leaders need to read much more The Economist and Harvard Business Review. That is, we need to understand what is going on. We need to look around. We need to talk to our children. We need to talk to our people to actually realize that the world that we need to build requires individual responsibility. In conclusion, I think there are two scenarios for the future. And the future starts in the summer when COVID-19 is over. The first scenario is the end of globalization. Segmented world, protected cultures and legal system, borders, barriers everywhere, different countries, different systems, different people, different language. Or we help build the future that our kids want, that at least is similar to the one we had. That's a daunting challenge. You remember my first graph. I hope that my son has at least the life that I have had. Okay? But this requires us to start working on it. Okay, let me stop here. I know that I'm over time. If there is any final question or comment, I'm willing to take it now.
Okay, just while people are thinking about any final questions, there's one perhaps bringing some of the themes together from Adam. So when we think about your theme of bringing down the walls, do you see any opportunities arising from the COVID-19 situation that may accelerate some aspects of bringing down the walls that you've touched on?
If there is only one, so the only advantage that I see of COVID-19 is the realization that for the first time, probably since the beginning of the 20th century, we have a crisis that is affecting everyone equally. There are no rich people, there are no poor people. And I think the income inequality wall is falling because our realization that our exposure to a pandemic only doesn't depend to a large extent on how rich we are. Okay? Health will depend on that, but not our exposure to a pandemic. Because other than that, the world is becoming more segmented. So I think this is the good news. Okay? I think the good news is that we see some societies in which where people have come together to help and to help each other, and that's very good news because we are creating cohesive social systems. But obviously, this will not last long once the pandemic is over. That's just temporary.
Okay, so Arturo, if people would like to keep in touch with your latest research, what would be the best way of connecting with you?
Well, you know, my contact is very easy. It's Twitter Arturo Bris. My email, you can share it, but it's arturo.bris@imd.org. And if you're interested, you know, I am starting my strategic finance program in 3 weeks. It's an online program. Actually, we're becoming pioneers by setting up an executive program in finance called Strategic Finance that is going to start in 3 weeks' time, fully online, where we're going to talk about COVID-19, the future of financial markets, what happens with different exchanges, what is the outlook for finance, and especially what are the good decisions that finance executives can take. So if you're interested in hearing about that program, you can go through our website at imd.org and get more information. Thank you.
And what we can do is we'll include some information about that in the notes that we send out following this session. And if anyone who's been listening in would like to be connected with Arturo or would like more information about IMD, please let us know and we can make those connections for you. So I think all that remains to say is to thank Arturo for being incredibly flexible. We had planned to do this followed by a nice drink at Sea Containers, but unfortunately a global pandemic got in our way. But thank you, Arturo, for a really informative, topical and entertaining session. We really appreciate your session, and a virtual round of applause. Thank you very much, and thanks to everyone for joining us today as well.
Thank you all. Thank you, and see you soon. Bye-bye.